My name is Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to our program tonight with author Catherine Grace Katz, who's joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the public libraries of Glencoe and Highland Park. I'd like to make a special shout out to Beth Keller at Highland Park for her part in helping make this evening happen. The program is being recorded and will be put on the library's YouTube channel next week. This being a webinar, participants can't ask questions directly, but you're very welcome to put your questions into Q&A or chat, and I will ask them on your behalf toward the end of Ms. Katz's program. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of The Daughters of Yalta, you can easily do so through the bookstall in Winnetka. A purchase link will be placed in the chat. Thank you to the bookstall for working with us on this event. You can also, of course, check it out from your local library, although it's been very hard to find lately because people keep reading it. Closed captioning is enabled for those who want it. You can opt into it by selecting live transcription and then show subtitles. Before we get started, I'm going to put a very quick two-question poll on the screen that I appreciate your answers. We're just trying to get an idea of how many there are watching tonight and where you're coming from. Thanks again for being here tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest. Catherine Grace Katz is a writer and historian from Winnetka. She graduated from Harvard in 2013 with a BA in history and received her master's in philosophy in modern European history from Christ's College, University of Cambridge in 2014, where she wrote her dissertation on the origins of modern counterintelligence practices. After graduating, she worked in finance in New York City before a fortuitous visit to the bookstore in the lobby of her Manhattan office building led her to return to history and writing. She's currently pursuing a JD at Harvard Law School, and The Daughters of Yalta is her first book. Ms. Katz, we're so pleased to have you here with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Grace, and to the Glencoe and Highland Park Libraries for having me. I'm so excited to be joining you, not least because, as Grace mentioned, I grew up in Winnetka. I have been a huge fan of the North Shore Library since I was tiny. I used to do the summer reading program every summer. And I think that if there was a competition, I think I read so many books that I probably would have won that. But the Glencoe Library especially has been very near and dear to my heart. I used to study for my finals there while I was at New Trier. I loved sitting down in front of the fireplace, which was always the coziest spot to study and make finals not so bad. That horrible post-Christmas New Trier finals schedule. I don't know if they still have that. But more immediately, the Glencoe Library and all of the libraries in the North Shore were really instrumental for me as I was writing the book. For much of the time I was writing it, I actually didn't have continuous access to a university library since I was kind of not at Harvard at the time. And so the Glencoe Library's collection of history books especially was so important to me as I was doing the research. They have absolutely everything I needed, and whatever they didn't have, I could certainly get from Highland Park, Winnetka, Lake Forest, Wilmette, just really, truly a wonderful resource that we're also lucky to have in our community. So thank you so much to the libraries, especially Glencoe Library, who definitely let me have books checked out for well longer than anyone should have them. But I promise I didn't lose any of them. So thank you very, very much. I thought I would get started tonight by showing a couple of photographs, some of which you may have seen before, some of which may be new to you, a few which may give you a little peek at some Winnetka days of past. So I'll get started by sharing my screen. I'd love to start with this photograph because this is one that I think is pretty familiar to a number of people of, some of those iconic images of the Second World War. This is one of the few pictures that we have of Winston Churchill, FDR, and Joseph Stalin all together. This is the big three, and you can see their military advisors behind them. And this photograph was actually taken at the Yalta Conference in the courtyard of Levadia Palace. And this is a picture that you'll often see on textbooks and history books. It is very, very iconic and notable. But what I think is really striking about this picture is that you can see the look on their faces. This is not the image of three men who are almost victorious, who are about to end a war. It's the three men who really are carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. At this point in the war, it looks like the battle in Europe is finally going to draw to a close sometime in the late spring or early summer. And so now the race is on to see which of the Allied armies will be the first to liberate Berlin. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Bulge has just ended. And so they really are making very quick progress towards Germany about to cross the border. This leaves several questions open. First is what to do about Germany in the post-war period. Should Germany be allowed to remain one country, or should it be broken up into a group of smaller nations in hopes that they can't rise up as a belligerent for a third time in half a century? Also extremely important to the future of Europe once the war ends, especially to Winston Churchill, is the future of Poland. Britain went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty at the outset, and he wants to make sure that he doesn't return to London and look his colleagues from the Polish government, which has been in exile since the very beginning, in the eye and tell them that they were not able to secure that which they went to defend in the first place. Stalin, meanwhile, has some other ideas when it comes to Poland. He is very much emblematic of his predecessors, including the czars who came before him, and seeing a great weakness on the western flank through the flatlands of Poland. Poland has been the corridor through which the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before had been invaded multiple times, dating all the way back to the Napoleonic era. The Nazis were only the most recent to use that channel to invade the Soviet Union. And so Stalin wants to make sure that when the war is over, after all the sacrifices made by the Red Army, that they were going to have, as he calls it, friendly neighbors on their borders, that the government in Poland is going to be sympathetic to the interests of the Kremlin. FDR, meanwhile, has his thoughts a little bit more oriented towards the Pacific, where the war is not nearly as advanced as it is in Europe. At this point, they don't yet know if the atomic bomb is going to be an option. Iwo Jima has not yet happened. And so FDR is looking at the potential for a ground invasion of the Japanese home islands, which could lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers. FDR's priority is saving as many American lives as possible. And in order to do this, he wants to bring the Soviet Union into the war against Japan in exchange for certain territorial concessions. FDR's other priority is much more oriented towards the long view and about securing his own personal legacy as well. He wants to succeed where Woodrow Wilson failed at the end of World War I. And he wants to create an international peace organization, one that can, unite the countries around the world in a way of securing, not perhaps eternal peace, as that's probably a bit of a lofty goal, but at least peace in Europe for at least the next 50 years. He sees this also as a way to bring the Soviet Union into the international community once the war is over and the common enemy has been defeated. So that's where we are at this point. And this is these are some of the issues that are set on the table for the three leaders to discuss once they arrive at Yalta. One thing that I did not realize until I really started doing the research for this book was just what it took to get to the Yalta Conference. If you look at this map, you can see just how far away Yalta is. This is in the Crimea, which is a place that will probably be familiar to you with certain activity that's been happening there between Russia and Ukraine over the last few years. But at this point in the war, Stalin recognizes that he holds more cards than do his allies. They want his cooperation on a number of points. And so if they want to meet, they're going to have to come to him. He is paranoid about security. He doesn't want to leave his security apparatus in the Soviet Union. He's also very afraid of flying. He claims that it's because of his health. His doctors advise him not to fly and not to travel abroad. But really, it is very much a power play to make them come to him. Meanwhile, despite this excuse about his health, FDR is actually dying of congestive heart failure, though at this point it is a secret and nobody knows. So Churchill and FDR are so determined to meet with Stalin that they agree to make this arduous journey, which is one that no security team of any president or prime minister would ever allow today because it involves some very real danger. First, Churchill has to fly 1,300 miles by plane to Malta, where he will rendezvous with FDR. And very tragically, on the way to Malta, one of the planes carrying members of the British Foreign Office delegation crashes off the coast of Italy, and several people are killed, which really casts a shadow over the beginning of the conference for the British. Meanwhile, FDR has to make a week-long journey by ship in a destroyer convoy across the Atlantic Ocean, where they're still sighting enemy U-boats. Once they arrive at Malta, Churchill and FDR then fly a further almost 1,400 miles to the Crimea over enemy-occupied islands with anti-aircraft units. One of the advanced planes actually gets its tail shot up by one of these units, and they're flying at very low altitude in unpressurized planes. When they finally arrive in the Crimea, they land at a dangerously short runway at an airfield that's shrouded in fog, and then they have to drive a further 6 hours over battle-scarred roads, sometimes at no more than 20 miles an hour, until they finally arrive at Lavadia Palace on the Black Sea. Lavadia Palace was once home to Tsar Nicholas II and his family, and it really was a country retreat for his family away from the pressures of court life. And here the Tsar and his children would play tennis, they would swim in the sea, they would go horseback riding. It really was very much a family home. But tragically, all of this changed in 1917 when the Tsar and his family were brutally murdered. The Soviets took over, and in turn, they nationalized the Tsar's palace and turned this place, Levadia Palace, into a home for favored Soviet workers needing rest and relaxation. The Soviets were in control until the Nazis came to the Crimea, and they used Levadia Palace as their Crimean headquarters. The Soviets had pushed out the Nazis several months before the Yalta Conference took place. But on the way, the Nazis stripped the palace of absolutely everything that they could take with them. They took out all of the furniture, all of the art, the dishes, the silverware, literally down to the doorknobs, which they could strip out and use as scrap metal. The Soviets have just 3 weeks from the time the three delegations agree that this is the place where they're going to hold the meeting that they must have in the very near future. And so they quickly have to restock the palace of absolutely everything that they need, which means that they take the contents of glamorous hotels in Moscow, like the Hotel Metropole, which might be familiar to you from Amor Towl's wonderful novel, A Gentleman in Moscow. And they have to cart the contents of the hotels 1,000 miles south by train. And so when the delegates arrive, they find dishes emblazoned with the distinctive Metropole M. Of course, this is something that the Soviets do best by throwing manpower at the situation. However, they also have to conscript Romanian workers and POWs, nearby laborers, and so the place is teeming with people, doing everything that they need to do to get this place, which is in great disrepair, ready for one of the most important conferences in history. However, they're not the only type of people or critters running around. There are tons of bed bugs everywhere. They have moved in when the Nazis moved out. The place is infested with bed bugs. They have to spray everything in DDT. And this being the Soviet Union, of course, they are not the only kinds of bugs that are around. Of course, there are also the listening variety, which the Soviets have installed throughout the private quarters where the president will be staying. So this gives you a little bit of an image of what exactly was taking place behind the scenes of this famous photograph. And I think this is also very emblematic of the Soviet Union at this time, where what you see on the surface is not necessarily indicative of that which lies beneath. There is a beautiful facade, but the reality behind the scenes is much more complex. So again, this gives a little bit more context for this famous picture. It explains a bit why they look so exhausted, these grimaces on their faces, but all is not easy at the Yalta Conference by any means. However, what I also find really striking about this photograph is looking at it in pair with another, which was taken from just a slightly different angle, a few moments apart, which shows a very different scene. Here you can see off to the side, there are actually two young women. And this is a view that many people had never seen before, and I certainly hadn't before I started working on this book. Off to the side, you can see Sarah Churchill, who's the 30-year-old daughter of the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Kathleen Harriman, who's the 27-year-old daughter of the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averil Harriman. And just outside the scope of this shot is Anna Roosevelt, the third daughter present at Yalta, who is the 38-year-old daughter of the president. This photograph brought to mind several questions. First, it made me think, of all the people these leaders could have brought with them to serve as their aides at this conference, what was so unique about the skills and abilities and experiences of their daughters that made them the perfect partners to serve as their aides at this conference, which is taking place right on the precipice between World War and Cold War? And secondly, we have a tendency to think of Churchill and FDR as these larger than life figures to the extent where they almost become more than human. And yet, at the end of the day, they're also someone's dad. And that is just something that we don't often think about. And so I began to wonder, what would it have been like to be their child, to be their daughters, present with them at the moment that history was unfolding? So before I introduce you to each of the three daughters in turn, I want to introduce you to someone else. This is me in third grade, third grade in Greeley School. Which many of you, I'm sure, know involves a very special experience where we get to go and live like pioneers for a day and go to the Pioneer Room. This is something that I had been looking forward to throughout my entire childhood because I think it was very clear from an early age that I would love history. I grew up loving movies like The Sound of Music and White Christmas and The Great Escape, these great stories from World War II. And I used to chase my grandfather around at Thanksgiving with a notepad and a pen and asking him to tell me his stories of growing up during the Depression and serving as an officer in the Navy during the war. And so this idea of the Pioneer Room loomed very large in my childhood. And so when the day finally came, I was so excited. And it just was really a very striking moment for me because it was the first time that I really thought about literally putting myself in, in the shoes of the people who came before me, the people who were about my age, what it would have been like to live in their time. And that's something that has really stayed with me and I think continues to inform the way that I approach history. I think it was a surprise to no one when I went off to college and became a history major. This is me on the morning that I turned in my senior thesis at Harvard, and I had 125 books checked out from the library, which my roommate thought was hilarious, and so she insisted that we had to take a picture with all of them. So here you see them. And while I was writing my thesis at Harvard, I ended up having this unexpected sort of experience with Winston Churchill that I was not anticipating. Inspired by my love of The Great Escape, one of my favorite movies from when I was little, which is also the subject of my 8th grade term paper, I ended up writing my thesis about British prisoner of war escape narratives and their place in British culture. And what I didn't realize when I started writing this was that Winston Churchill had actually written the first of what we think of as these types of books about his own escape from a POW camp during the Boer War in 1899, when he was just 24 years old. And it was the tale of his thrilling escape, which launched him to fame in Britain and really jump-started his political career. Little did I know that I wasn't quite done with Winston Churchill, because shortly thereafter, I was able to fulfill really what was a lifelong dream for me and go to Cambridge to study history. And I had been so excited about this, the idea of going to Cambridge or studying in England was something I'd wanted to do since I was about 5 years old, probably informed by all of the English children's literature that my mom read to us, which really stands out as one of my favorite memories from childhood. And for someone who loves history, there's no better place to be than Cambridge, where history just surrounds you at every turn. Here, I was writing a dissertation on early counterintelligence practices as they emerged in Britain during World War I, with a postal censorship program where the British government would read all the in and outbound foreign mail in hopes of finding enemy spies who might be in their midst. And what I didn't realize as I started this project was that Winston Churchill was the Home Secretary at the time during World War I, and he was the person largely responsible for this program. So here I had spent 2 years with studying Winston Churchill in detail, however, not as Prime Minister during World War II. And very sadly, at the end of my time at Cambridge, I had to say goodbye to history, at least for the short term. I hope to find my ways back someday, but I ended up trading in this beautiful vista for the hustle and bustle of New York City, which you can see looks a little different. I was working in finance, like so many people who are recent graduates. I think finance is something that they need to try, and I gave it a shot, which taught me a lot. But it also quickly became apparent that this is not what I wanted to do. So I began to think about applying to law school. However, in the lobby of my office was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, which is named after Winston Churchill's country home. And this is the type of bookstore that can exist only in Manhattan, and they specialize in books by and about Churchill. And so I found myself on afternoons when I just couldn't take the Excel modeling anymore. I'd say I was going down to the lobby to get a coffee, but really I'd be wandering into the bookstore and chatting with the owner about all things history and Churchill. Shortly thereafter, he suggested that I should meet a group called the International Churchill Society, which was made up of scholars and academics, but also professionals of all walks of life that want to encourage people to study history, foreign relations, and pursue careers in public service. The Churchill family is also very involved in this organization. And so they happened to be having a dinner across the street from my office at the Waldorf, featuring Madeleine Albright as the keynote speaker. And I thought, I would love to attend this. I'd love to learn from Secretary Albright. So I said, if I can come and check coats or show people to their table, I'd love to come. And they said, no, just come on over. We love when there are young people excited about history. So off I went to this dinner, not realizing that this would quickly change my path. At the dinner, I met the Churchill family and many other incredible people. And shortly thereafter, turns out that they were opening the papers of Churchill's middle daughter, Sarah, to outside researchers for the first time. And they asked if I would have any interest in writing an article about them for their magazine, Finest Hour. This meant going back to Cambridge, where I'd done my graduate work, looking at Sarah's papers. And I was very excited about this, not only for a chance to re-engage with history and do a bit of writing, but also because I had had a slight experience of sorts with Sarah Churchill from the time I was a little girl. And it was very exciting to be able to learn more about her. My family has gone on vacation to the Cloister in Sea Island, Georgia every summer since I was literally a baby. And on the wall of the Cloister is this beautiful picture of Sarah Churchill on her wedding day. She had eloped to Sea Island with her second husband, Anthony Beecham, in 1949. And I'd walked past this picture of Sarah countless times since I was tiny. And I'd always stop and wonder a little bit about her, and was just curious about her life and what it would have been like to be Winston Churchill's daughter. And here is my chance to do so. If people know Sarah Churchill today, it's usually that she'd been an actress and a dancer, and even starred in a movie with Fred Astaire in 1951 called Royal Wedding. However, as I began to learn more about Sarah from her own words, I quickly found a very complex and nuanced, fascinating, and brilliant person who I was very excited to get to know, first through her relationship with her father. From the time Sarah Churchill was a little girl, she felt like she could understand the way that her father thought better than anyone. She liked to say that she could follow in silent step with him, following along with his every thought, even if he didn't say them, because she just understood the way his mind worked, and she would train herself to think like him. A lot of this came from hours that she'd spend with him in the garden of their home in Chartwell in the countryside, where Winston Churchill would engage in one of his favorite pastimes, which happened to be bricklaying. He found this very relaxing, and so he built many, many yards of brick walls around the gardens of their home, and Sarah would be out there with him for hours at a time, handing him the bricks, mixing the cement, maintaining the plumb line to make sure it stayed straight. And she just really came to have this very natural rapport with her father through those hours together. Sarah was also very much like her father in the sense that she wanted to chart her own path on her own terms and really make a name for herself. But for a woman of her class and era, there really weren't too many professional opportunities open to her. She would not have been encouraged to go to university. But she realized that there was one path that she might pursue, and that was acting. For any other father, perhaps that might have been a very scandalous suggestion, but perhaps Winston was a little bit broken in by his own mother, the American debutante Jenny Jerome, who scandalized British polite society by writing plays for London's West End. She was rumored to have had scores of lovers and a snake tattooed around her wrist. So by comparison, just wanting to be an actress seemed rather tame. Sarah did become an actress and was relatively successful, but quickly she fell in love with the star of her show, a man named Vic Oliver, who happened to be an Austrian citizen. And at this point, Winston Churchill was very concerned about the winds of war that were coming from the continent, especially Germany and Austria, and was very concerned about Sarah's status if she was married to an Austrian. However, Sarah was in love, and she and her husband eloped to New York. But tragically, this marriage quickly broke down, and Sarah found herself wanting to chart her own path again in a different way, coinciding with the beginning of the war and her father's tenure as prime minister. Sarah decided to do her bit for her country, and she joined the women's branch of the Royal Air Force, where she became a photographic reconnaissance intelligence analyst, where she looked at photos that had been taken thousands of feet in the sky by recon pilots, and she'd make intelligence assessments based on these pictures, looking at the types of shadows that ships cast in harbors to determine what kinds of ships they were. She'd look at fields where the grass had been trampled and determine whether that was because of an enemy troop movement or if it was because of just some cows grazing in the field. Sarah was very involved with many major military operations, including Operation Torch, which was the invasion of North Africa. And sometimes she even knew the details of these operations even better than her father, to his great amusement and great pride. One day she came home for a short leave for the weekend and was chatting with her father before dinner. And he said to her, at this very moment, go 542 ships sailing towards the Mediterranean. And Sarah said, actually, Papa, it's 543. And Churchill was so delighted by this that she was doing so well that he went down to dinner, bragged about her to that night's dinner guest, who happened to be Eleanor Roosevelt, who repeated the story to the newspapers the next day about how proud Churchill was of his daughter. Sarah then found herself hauled in front of her superiors, demanding to know who had leaked classified information to Mrs. Roosevelt and thence to the newspapers, and Sarah could only say that it was her father bragging about her. Sarah also had the opportunity to join her father in several extremely important matters of the wartime of her wartime work, and she had the chance to join him first as his aide-de-camp at the Tehran Conference in 1943, which was the first time Churchill, FDR, and Stalin met together, where they laid the plans for the invasion of Normandy. Early in the war, Winston and Clementine Churchill had decided that someone from the family should go with him when he traveled abroad, partially as a protector and confidant, but also for several other reasons. And one of these being is kind of an unofficial family historian. Churchill had written his wartime memoirs after World War I. He wanted to do the same after World War II. And so he wanted someone at his side who could help record what was taking place outside of the official conference discussions to capture the real life around the conference. Sarah was much like her father. She had a real gift for writing, a beautiful voice that came out through the written word, and she was the perfect person to capture this. She also, through her acting experience, was wonderfully suited to be a diplomat, where there's so much of kind of a shared elements between acting and diplomacy, where there are things that are left unsaid, subtle nuances that you have to interpret, ways of delivering layered messages. This is something that Sarah was very good at, on top of also having military experience and also that fundamental understanding of the way her father's mind worked. So Sarah went off to Tehran with her father in November of 1943, where two other fathers quickly realized just how valuable a daughter diplomat could be. The first of these was Averell Harriman, who had just begun his time as the American ambassador to the Soviet Union. Averell Harriman is one of the perhaps most influential people of the 20th century that many people don't recognize today, but he was the chairman of Union Pacific Railroad. He was the founder of Brown Brothers Harriman, shipping conglomerates, manganese mines investments, Newsweek magazine. He was also the founder of Sun Valley, which is the first glamorous American ski resort, which he created in order to encourage people to use his trains to take them out west by giving them a glamorous destination. Averell Harriman had two daughters, Mary and Kathleen, and he wasn't especially close to them when they were little girls. He was always off chasing business deals, and he and his wife divorced when they were very young. And it was only when his daughters were teenagers that he really came back into their lives in a meaningful way. Kathy Harriman's mother died when she was in high school, and Kathy received a letter from her father at the time. And he wrote to her and said, I know I'm not the most involved father. I'm certainly not a warm and fuzzy father by any means. However, I do believe that we can become the best and finest of friends. And he made an overture to both of his daughters, saying, if it is of any interest to you, I would love for you to be as involved in my work and my business as to whatever extent that you'd like. It's something that was very ahead of his time, very, very forward-looking. But there was a reason that this was potentially, could lay the groundwork for them to be the best and finest of friends. Kathy was very much like her father in that she was very adventurous. She was a great athlete. She was an expert equestrian, crack shot, and an Olympic level skier. She was in fact the alternate for what became the canceled 1940 Olympics. She was part of the ski team. And Kathy quickly jumped at the chance to join her father in his work. They began to solidify a partnership that would see them through the next number of years through Sun Valley and their shared love of skiing. Kathy would spend her school vacations with him in Sun Valley, where she would help him with everything from publicity for the resort to managing VIP guests like Ernest Hemingway, even doing a bit of recon on rival resorts that were popping up in the area. Averell Harriman had largely left his business career aside to join the New Deal administration in the 1930s, largely the urging of his older sister, Mary Harriman Rumsey, who after Frances Perkins was the most senior woman in Roosevelt's government. And the family had a genuine passion for public service and felt a keen sense of obligation to give back. And so Harriman joined his sister in the New Deal, despite having previously been a Republican, where he became very good friends with Harry Hopkins. When the war broke out and the United States was still neutral, FDR devised the Lend-Lease program to support Britain while maintaining this neutrality. And so he needed someone to run this program from London, and Harry Hopkins suggested that Averell Harriman would make the ideal choice. So off Harriman went to London in early 1941, and he thought, gosh, this would be a great opportunity for my 23-year-old daughter to come with me in the middle of the Blitz and become a war reporter. Ever adventurous, Kathleen jumped at the chance, and off she flew to London and arrived there just days after the worst bombing of the Blitz. While in London, Kathy and her father became very close friends with the Churchill family. One Churchill in particular, as some of you may know, that being Pamela, the Prime Minister's daughter-in-law, who was married to Winston Churchill's son, Randolph. And Averell Harriman and Pamela quickly began an affair. Kathy arrived, she became very good friends with Pamela, but she quickly realized that her new best friend was not all she seemed, that she was in fact having an affair with Averell, despite the fact that she was even a year younger than Kathy. But Kathy recognized that this could work to her advantage. By covering up for the affair, it would guarantee her place in London, and her father wouldn't send her home if things became more dangerous. But the connections between the two families went much deeper. They genuinely were very good friends. And in fact, they were celebrating Kathleen's 24th birthday on December 7th, 1941, when they all learned the news together about the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the attack on Pearl Harbor. In October 1943, Averell Harriman became the ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Kathy decided to continue her adventure with him during the war. And she flew off to Moscow with him, where she decided to learn Russian on behalf of both of them, knowing that he wouldn't have time. And she was able to interpret for him in social settings and really became his assistant ambassador in many ways. And she was the American woman who went on to have more experience with Stalin in his inner circle than any other American woman in history. When it came time for Yalta, Averil Harriman knew Kathleen was the person that he needed at his side to help him really working almost as I think of like a protocol officer at the State Department, serving as a liaison between the American and Soviet advance teams, making sure that everything was just so to foster the most productive diplomacy, and also prepare briefing materials for the Americans who had never set foot in the Soviet Union, to help them become acquainted with Russian history and culture and customs. As a token of Kathy's wartime service later on, by the time the war was over, Kathy had clearly made quite an impression on Stalin, because this horse that you can see in this picture with her here is not just any old horse, but is in fact a horse that was given to her by Stalin. The third daughter was Anna Roosevelt, and Anna was the oldest of the three daughters, and she was also the only mother. However, she had the least experience when it came to foreign policy and this whole world of diplomacy. When Anna was a little girl, she and her father had a very close relationship. And I love this picture of the two of them together when Anna's really young at Campobello Island, because it's one of the few pictures that we have of FDR standing, which I think is really striking. And it's just a lovely and very sweet image. Anna and her father had this shared passion of nature and the environment. They would go on long horseback rides together through the grounds around their home in the Hudson River Valley in Hyde Park in New York. And FDR would teach Anna about the different types of trees and plants and birds that they would see. And Anna dreamed that someday she would go up to become the co-custodian and conservator of some sort of their home and their land in Hyde Park. But all of this changed very suddenly when FDR became paralyzed from his polio diagnosis. And Anna suddenly found herself on the outside looking in, now held at an arm's length. And suddenly FDR was surrounded by doctors and nurses and all of his political colleagues who needed to come to him. There's no room for Anna in this world, and so she was sent away to school, which is something that she was detested. And her parents insisted that she become a debutante, despite the fact they often ridiculed that society and were otherwise rather progressive. The mentality, however, did not extend to their daughter. Anna spent a little bit of time at Cornell, but she left when she was just 20 years old to make a very rebellious marriage to a man named Curtis Dahl. They had 2 children, but the marriage quickly broke down. However, Anna did fall in love soon after, this time with a journalist that she met on her father's campaign trail. This journalist's name was John Boettiger, and he was in fact a Republican, which I think is just a good reminder that even in today's political climate, that love can conquer all. Anna and John got married, they moved to Seattle, they had another baby and became the joint editors of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, a newspaper which still exists today. And they were very happy there until John decided to join the army and do his bit, and he shipped out to the Mediterranean at the end of 1943. Anna decided that rather than stay in Seattle by herself, she would move home, and home, of course, at this time meant the White House. Anna arrived for Christmas in 1943, and she realized that something was different about her father. He was just not quite as sharp on the details as she remembered. He would stare off into space for a long period of time, sit there with his mouth hanging open as if he couldn't quite get enough air, and Anna became very alarmed. There were just small and subtle changes that you might not notice if you saw FDR day in, day out, but Anna hadn't seen him for several months, and this change to her was quite striking. So she insisted that he have a comprehensive medical examination. He finally agreed to this in March of 1944, and the exam revealed that he was in fact dying of congestive heart failure. At the time, there was no cure for this, only mitigating symptoms in hopes of prolonging his life. But Anna she was sworn to secrecy. She could not tell anyone about his diagnosis. Only she and the doctor knew. Even Eleanor really couldn't come to terms with the idea that he was very ill. And curiously, FDR never once asked what was wrong with him. And you can understand if you're the wartime president, any sense of your own mortality might just be too much for you. And so it really fell to Anna to now implement the changes to try to alleviate as many stresses as possible, which is very challenging when your father is the president of the United States trying to win a war. So she would help determine who really needed an audience with the president and who could meet with someone else, sometimes even going so far as to take papers out of his inbox at night and distribute them to others who she felt could handle them. Anna had long wanted to join her father for one of his overseas meetings, but instead he'd always turned to one of her four younger brothers instead as his aide, really as a physical support to help him stand and move. But there was never really a good reason why Anna couldn't come as well and couldn't be helpful, especially after Sarah Churchill came to the Tehran conference. And Anna was always very hurt that he didn't want to involve her in this way. And in fact, she wrote to her mother their shared frustration with FDR on this front, that sometimes they felt that FDR merely wanted to, appease a troublesome female from time to time, and instead they should stay at home and keep the home fires burning, which is very surprising when you think of FDR as a very progressive president otherwise. But in January 1945, FDR clearly could sense that Anna was doing something very important to protect him and recognized that he really could not get along without her. And so he cabled his friend Winston Churchill and said, "If you're thinking of bringing your daughter to this conference again, I'm thinking of bringing my daughter, Anna." So Anna finally got her wish to be at his side, to be the person who was invaluable to him in the most important moments, which is something that she dreamed about from the time she was a little girl and thought that those days were long gone. But here was her chance, but tragically, it was coming at a time when she knew this would probably be the last opportunity that she would ever have with him in this way, as he was dying and was getting sicker by the day. This is a photograph of the three daughters together at the Yalta conference, and I love it because you can see a bit of their unique personalities here. You can see Sarah in her military uniform, Anna in the middle in a sensible tweed coat, and Kathy on the end in a very glamorous fur. And though they each came to the Yalta conference with different skills and experiences that made them the ideal partners for their fathers in this environment, I like to think of them collectively almost as daughter diplomats, where they don't speak for the government as someone from the State Department or the Foreign Office might, but they speak with the weight of their fathers behind them. And this allows them to go and to deliver subtle, nuanced messages that someone in a more official capacity might not be able to do, to collect information and to observe where others might not be able to go and bring that back to their fathers. And in this instance, that includes going out into the local community, into Yalta, meeting the local people whose lives had been summarily destroyed by the war and whose futures are being reordered literally by the conference negotiations that are taking place at that very moment. And this is a perspective that is invaluable to their fathers. I also think that for each of them, they really represented the embodiment of the future that their fathers were trying to protect. Yes, of course, there's this nebulous desire to create a world that was better for their children, kind of metaphorically. But for each of them, they also want to leave a better world for their daughters who are there at their side at this conference. I'll just stop sharing my screen there and close just with a few final thoughts about the experience of the daughters at Yalta and what that can tell us about our world today. And one of the first things that comes to mind as we think about geopolitical tensions is the continued antagonism between Russia and the West, which has really been very present ever since 1945 as the relationship between the Soviet Union and the West began to fray as the war was nearing a close. When you think about the way that leaders interact with the Russian leader today, and think about FDR at the time, through Anna's eyes, you can really see FDR striving to build this personal bond with Stalin. He has a really close personal bond with Churchill. This is something that was very much the foundation of the special relationship and was a very genuine friendship. And he wants to try to build this with Stalin too, in a way that it will carry them through to the post-war period. However, he kind of misreads the situation, and unfortunately, he's not successful in building this bond with Stalin that he has with Churchill. He relies too much on these ideas of kind of the touchy-feely side of politics. He thinks that if he can get Stalin to like him, he'll be more amenable to being cooperative. However, even though Stalin may like you, and I believe that he did like and respect FDR very much, it's not going to change the way that Stalin pursues foreign policy. I think this is a similar trap that leaders in a more contemporary period in the United States have fallen into as well. Going back to the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, you saw all of them try to build a personal bond with Putin, and unfortunately, that has yet to prove successful. And so I think it's important to think, as we are, partway through the first year of a new administration, of trying to find common areas of interest where we can cooperate with Russia, but not building on kind of that bond between leaders that we might in other capacities. I also think about the presence of the daughters and what that also can tell us about the appropriate role for the unelected family members of elected officials to play in public duties. This has been something that has been top of mind over the last few years in a way that we really didn't have to think about before that for quite a while, because the children of the president in the last few administrations had been very young children. But what about adult first children? How involved should they be? To some extent, it's like when you marry someone, you marry their family. When you elect someone, in a way, you elect their family too. And we have, carved out a role that we acknowledge is appropriate for the first lady or the first spouse. But when it comes to adult first children, we don't have this consensus. And so I think that's something that we as Americans should talk about. And perhaps the activities of the Daughters at the Yalta Conference can help enlighten us on this front as well. And finally, well, I'm so glad that we have the technology to be able to chat together tonight. I wish I was with all of you in person in Glencoe and Highland Park. I am at school right now, and I wish I could be there with you, but I'm glad we can do this. However, I really think that the experience of everyone who participated in the Yalta Conference and Churchill and FDR's desire to have these really important negotiations in person with Stalin, as well as FDR's commitment to founding the United Nations as a forum for diplomats from all around the world to come together and to discuss important issues, expedite diplomacy, and really get to know one another, just goes to show how important in-person interactions are, and that they, while we can use technology as a tool to help us to have more conversations, that it doesn't necessarily replace the importance of in-person conversations. So I hope that we'll be able to return to having that happening most of the time in foreign policy, and certainly in our interactions together. And so I hope that I can see all of you in person at some point on the North Shore, and perhaps at the library. And with that, I will close and would love to answer any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you so much. That was amazing and interesting. We do have a couple questions, and I expect probably a few more will come in. Elizabeth would like to know, did the women of Yalta remain in touch?
They did. I think there's an impulse that we would like to think that, they came to Yalta, became best friends, kind of really, forged through this experience of being, some of the only women that knew what it was like to be in that environment. And while they certainly liked each other to a point, I think that their loyalties really were first and foremost to their fathers and to their countries. And so you can see the ebb and flow of their relationships among the daughters very much mirroring the relationships of their fathers, and kind of that up and down, even over the course of the week. They did stay in touch in later years. And I think, interestingly, just because of the intertwined nature of so many of the people really at the height of power during the war, their lives would forever intersect, just kind of inevitably, because of who they were and all of these connections between their families. Of course, the Churchill and Harriman families would end up being bonded forever through the presence of Pamela. She and April Harriman ended up resuming their love affair years later, after he was a widower and she was a widow. They got married, and so Kathy's one-time best friend became her stepmother. And so you see those two families kind of intertwined. But they also did have this shared knowledge of what it was like to be some of the only young women who had seen what they'd seen during the war and knew the pressures of what that life was like. And so without giving away too much at the end, they did experience several similar tragedies that I think were very much born by the lack of understanding we had about mental health and PTSD from the war at the time. And they're able to kind of provide comfort and solace to each other in those difficult moments in ways that are very poignant. So I won't say too much about it and give away the end, but they do stay in touch in unique ways.
Thank you. Vera wants to know, have you ever been to Russia?
I have not been to Russia. I would love to go to Russia, but by the time I started researching this, I did look into going to Yalta, which is something I'd really love to do. But by then, the Russia had invaded the Crimea. State Department strongly advised against it, as did the British Foreign Office. Basically, you can go, but you're on your own. And if you get into trouble, we can't help you. So that was inadvisable at the time, but I hope that I can go someday. Maybe with my younger brother's at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, getting his master's, and he is focusing on U.S.-Russia relations, learning to speak Russian. So, once he's fully fluent in Russian, maybe I can tag along with him.
Absolutely. I hope so. Mary asks, did Stalin have a daughter or a young female advisor?
He did have a daughter. Her name is Svetlana, and at the time of Yalta, she was 19 years old, recently married and pregnant with her first child. But unlike the other daughters, she and her father did not have a close relationship by any means, and he never would have thought to bring her. She did speak English, so she could have been valuable to him as a daughter diplomat like the others. But Stalin really did not like her to interact with foreigners, especially Westerners. Their relationship was really complicated by the fact that, as you can imagine, that Svetlana learned as a teenager that her mother had committed suicide and was really driven to it by Stalin's cruelty. And so she decided to rebel against him and ended up falling in love and having an affair with a much older and married Soviet Jewish cinematographer, which Stalin took exception to. And so he sent this man to Siberia, literally. And then she rebelled again a few years later, married her classmate Grigory Morozov, who was also Jewish. And again, Stalin was not happy about this, so he refused to ever meet his son-in-law. So that's the state of affairs between Svetlana and Stalin at the time of Yalta. But Churchill did actually meet Svetlana once, and he was one of the few Western leaders to do so. And it happened when he came to Moscow earlier in the war to meet with Stalin. And Stalin sort of brought Svetlana out at dinner time, almost like a prop to try to impress upon Churchill that he was a family man too, which is very odd when you think about Stalin. And so Svetlana and Churchill chatted a little bit, and Churchill told her about his own redhead daughter, Sarah. Svetlana was also a redhead. And after that, Svetlana sent a brooch to Sarah as kind of a daughter-to-daughter gesture of diplomacy. And Sarah ended up wearing the brooch on her uniform throughout the duration of the conference, which I think is a lovely nod to the daughter who wasn't there.
Great, thank you. Another question, this is an interesting one. Why was FDR so dismissive of Averell Harriman's advice?
Yes, that's a great question, and one that was exceedingly frustrating to Averell Harriman, and one that he didn't understand entirely either. At this point, FDR, he was very ill. And so I think there's a tendency to think about his relationship with Stalin and the way that he conducted negotiations with Stalin as perhaps weaker than it might have been otherwise if he hadn't been so sick. However, I would argue that FDR's point of view about Russia and about the Soviet Union and how to work with them was really formed well before he was ill. He didn't have a great depth of knowledge about Russian or Soviet history, and he thought that he could apply a lot of the same tools that made him really successful in domestic politics to foreign policy. And unfortunately, that just really didn't work well when it came to dealing with Stalin. And so he was willing to give Stalin the benefit of the doubt much more than he should have. Averell Harriman early on was actually quite sympathetic to a relationship with the Soviet Union. But when the alliance between Britain and the Soviet Union was formed in June of 1941, he thought that this was a really good move, that, even if they didn't see eye to eye, you could, find shared interests and kind of pursue a positive relationship like any business relationship. Kathy Harriman actually was much more perceptive about the difference of working with someone like Stalin compared to a different leader, because she, as a journalist, covered the press conferences with exiled European leaders like the Polish government in exile, and heard them warning for years that Stalin was not to be trusted. Averell Harriman then, once he becomes the ambassador, quickly realizes that Kathy was right as he experiences the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, in which thousands of Poles were killed when the Soviet Union could have stepped in very quickly. When the Poles tried to overthrow the Nazis, the Soviets just waited literally on the other side of the river and allowed the resistance movement to get crushed by the Nazis because it worked to their advantage. And Harriman sees this and realizes this is really kind of a wake-up moment. He wants to make sure FDR understands it. FDR really doesn't want to hear it. It kind of gets in the way of his own worldview about working with the Soviets, bringing them into the United Nations. And so at this point, Harriman is really frustrated, and he and Churchill see much more eye to eye than do Harriman and FDR, which is really difficult.
Thank you. Leslie has a question. In your lovely book, there were several references regarding the naivete of Roosevelt relative to recognizing details of this conference. Could you comment on the impact of this on U.S. policy and also on his executing a united front with Winston Churchill?
Sure. So, beyond just kind of personally not having a huge depth of knowledge about the Soviet Union and Soviet history, as I mentioned a minute ago, and some of this was kind of just emblematic of the United States as a whole, where we hadn't had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union since 1917 until early on in FDR's administration. So there was, a 20-year gap of lost knowledge about the Soviets. People didn't learn Russian in school. There was not a lot of business exchange between the two countries. So we were already kind of working from a very weak stance. Further exacerbated by not having great intelligence capabilities there. Britain, similarly, they did have spies in the Soviet Union, but actually pulled them out when they formed an alliance with the Russians, the idea that friends don't spy on each other. I think that's, we all know that was not a great idea. So the other problem for FDR, though, was not only that he didn't have a huge personal depth of knowledge, but he was very reluctant to rely on the experts at the State Department who did. He was somewhat skeptical of the State Department, and he and Harry Hopkins would joke around that state was full of nannies and cookie pushers, as they called them, very uncharitably. They were not nearly as liberal, kind of as much more of a kind of middle of the road organization where you had a lot of career people who weren't as partisan. And so FDR did not love working with them, and he also felt like they were going to kind of gum up the works if they came into the meetings with Stalin. So he didn't want to bring his top advisor on Eastern European affairs, James Clement Dunn, to Yalta because he did not have the same view as FDR of working with Stalin. So instead of bringing him or relying on Chip Bolin, who comes along really only in the capacity as translator, or George Kennan, who would become a wise man of the Cold War, but at this time is the number 2 to Averell Harriman in Moscow, he doesn't bring them with. Instead, he only brings Alger Hiss as an advisor. And Alger Hiss, unbeknownst to Roosevelt at the time, was a double agent working for the Soviets. So it's kind of a threefold problem all coming together in one. And so I think that just really goes to show the importance of relying on and involving your experts when you don't have that depth of knowledge yourself. And unfortunately, to FDR's detriment, he kind of had too much faith in his own powers of personal persuasion, and that really let him down in that relationship.
Thank you. Got a few more. Do you have time?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, great. There's a lot of interest. Tom and Barb would like to know, Mary Churchill also went to conferences with her father. What can you tell us about her?
Yes, and it's great timing to bring up Mary Churchill. I actually just was in London this past weekend at a conference, and Emma Soames, who's Mary's daughter, was there, and we did a program together. Emma just published an edited version of Mary's diary, wartime diaries. So we talked about the wartime experience of the two sisters, which was so much fun to talk with her. And yeah, so Mary came with Winston and Clementine when Winston came to the United States to meet with FDR. That was shortly before Tehran. And then she also went to Potsdam in 1945, which of course was interrupted by the British general election, at which time Churchill lost. And so he did not return to Potsdam at the time. Mary was 8 years younger than Sarah. And so there are kind of subtle differences in some of the ways that he relied on each of them. Mary was also in uniform. And so she had that experience like Sarah did of military operations, which was really valuable. But I think Sarah having just a little bit more experience, she, a little bit more just kind of really life experience, and her career previously as an actress kind of gave her some seasoning in some of these really tense conferences like Tehran and Yalta, where he needed someone who had kind of a multifaceted skills and experiences that maybe Mary didn't have as much at that point, but Mary was of course also very capable. I just think that for Tehran and Yalta, kind of that additional experience that Sarah had made her the one who was the right choice in those moments. Though of course, he really did rely on Mary too. And I think that just is also a testament to how much Churchill respected and admired and relied on the women in his life, especially his wife and his daughters.
Another question about a Churchill daughter, about Sarah. Can you discuss the relationship between her and Gil Wynand?
Yes. So there are so many interconnected relationships in this story. It kind of feels like everybody's having an affair with somebody else who's there. It feels like literally the only person not having an affair is Winston Churchill. He's super devoted to Clementine, which is wonderful. But yes, Sarah was having an affair with Gil Wynand, who was the American ambassador to Britain. He was not at the conference, actually, but she does write to him at the time. Harriman was having an affair with Pamela, couple other people at the conference are also having affairs with Pamela, including Major General Fred Anderson from the American military, and Peter Portal, who is the head of the RAF, is also besotted with Pamela. And then Kathy Harriman had a brief fling with FDR Jr. Earlier in the war when he was briefly in London. So it's just all these connections. But Sarah and Gil Winant really did have a very deep connection. They were kind of two old souls who had experienced similar kind of tragedies, and they kind of found each other and a lot of solace in each other. And Sarah was very careful not to openly acknowledge the relationship with her father, because that would have complicated his own relationship with Winant as the official kind of line to Roosevelt. So Sarah refers to the affair as that of which we both knew, but of which we did not speak. And it was kind of tragically almost like a doomed romance from the start. And it's I know, again, I don't want to give away too much of the book, but there's they found each other kind of really at a time when they both needed someone who understood, and life is not necessarily easy. And I think they both experienced that, but it really, they did have a very genuine bond.
Here's a question, not about who you're writing about, but about you. Ilana wants to know, your research, writing, and studying law requires tremendous self-control. What do you do for fun or to relax, or do you not have time for that?
Oh no, I got to make time for fun and to relax, because otherwise you go crazy and you get burnt out. It helps that I love what I do. I love writing. I love research. I love history. So really, writing this book felt like a joy to me. And I'm in law school, and I've always loved learning. And what's great is, here writing is a very solitary experience. Being part of law school gives me a community that I really enjoy being part of, and kind of having great conversations with friends and classmates. But I also love sports. I play a lot of tennis, watch a lot of tennis, college football, baseball, make time for friends, family, of course. And I always try to make sure that I really do, carve out, time dedicated, set aside to do fun things too, because it just, it's one of the most important things, I think, to working well, is also having balance. That's something that I've had to learn over the years. I'm sure some of you may have gone to New Trier who had kids who went to New Trier. And I swear to God, I never worked as hard as I did at New Trier until finishing a book and doing my first year of law school at the same time. And so I think if you can get through New Trier, you realize that you can do anything, and that helps.
Ms. Katz, I think you can do anything, honestly. Carol's got a question here. Did the women go into public service at all? Were there opportunities for careers of their own in the public?
Yeah, so I have this feeling that if they had been, someone like Sarah Churchill had been born 10 years later, which would have made her a contemporary of Margaret Thatcher, that maybe it would have occurred to her more that she might have had a career in public service. And I really think that Sarah was so well suited to it, perhaps even better than her brother Randolph, who did, go into politics. And Sarah could have, certainly been the Churchill to kind of carry on the Churchill family legacy in politics, but she didn't. She ended up, continuing with acting, and did star in a movie with Fred Astaire, so she certainly had success. Kathy Harriman returned to working as a journalist after the war. She went back to Newsweek in New York until she got married and had 3 sons, and was a really devoted mother, and saw her role as a mother as equally important to what she had done before, if not more, and really found a lot of fulfillment through that. But she didn't go into public service herself. And then Anna Roosevelt did sort of kind of have some role, kind of being kind of really the custodian of her parents' legacy, and both of her parents, her mother as well. And so she was involved in human rights. She and one of her husbands later, they went to Tehran for a couple of years. She was involved in radio a bit. She wrote a couple of books. So she did have a public platform as well, but never as an elected official, like her brothers who all ran for office.
Great, thank you. And we will take one more question, and then we got to wrap it up. And this is a what's next sort of question from Lewis. He says, do you have plans to write another book? And if so, what would be the subject? Because whenever you do a book, then immediately people want to know what's the next one. And then what kind of legal career do you plan to pursue?
I would love to answer the question. I just want to address one other question super quickly that I also see in the chat. Somebody asked how much is based on historical documents and letters and how much was added by the author.
Oh,
This
I didn't
is
see that one,
entirely
sorry.
nonfiction.
Yeah.
So I just do want to emphasize this is entirely nonfiction. It's not creative license. If I say the wind was blowing from the east, that's because somebody literally recorded that. And that we do have a wealth of diaries and letters and official documents, minutes from military records. So there's a plethora to draw upon. So this really is, while it does, I wanted it to read like a novel, almost in a way that you forgot you were reading nonfiction. It is entirely nonfiction. So I just wanted to make that point. Yeah, but what's next? Well, I've another year and a half of law school. So I got to finish my degree. And I want to get started on another book, but frustratingly, the archive that I need is still closed because of COVID. So I can't start on it immediately like I would really like to. But I really love these slice of time sorts of stories where you can see the world changing very quickly through just a few days through the lens of a particular event that brings together an interesting cast of characters that might not all otherwise find themselves in the same room. So I'm looking at a particular event in the later 1930s, kind of as other countries are starting to realize that perhaps Germany has not been appeased by remilitarizing the Rhineland, and kind of we're on this bubble almost of which way the relationship with Germany is going to go, kind of seen through a particular event. So that's the general sense.
And he also wondered about your legal career.
Yes. Well, I am not exactly sure how law and history come together. I definitely want to keep writing first and foremost. I look forward to a couple opportunities I have to see kind of a little bit more practically what working as a lawyer looks like over the next few months. But I really see history and the law as tools that can be used together to look at complex issues that have been with us for a long time and continue to be things that we think about today. And I hope that I can kind of use the tool of those two tools to help make sense of complex issues that we are still grappling with, and I think we'll grapple with for a long time to come.
Okay. Catherine Grace Katz, thank you so much for your time tonight. You've been a terrific presenter, and we really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for joining us, and good night. We'll see you at the next one.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's so nice to chat with you. Have a great night.
So long. Thank you.